One of the first signs that World War I was going to have massive, earth-shaking effects for every state that played a part in it occurred even before the war ended in 1917 in Russia, the Russian Revolution, which put to end centuries long of czarist autocratic rule and replaced it with a brand new kind of state that had never been tried before, a communist state that also adopted autocratic rule. So today we're going to be looking at that story, how it happened, why it happened, and just a very general description of events. First, we're going to look at the role of Lenin, Vladimir Lenin, this guy right here at the podium, and the creation of this new state, which replaced Russia on the map, the Soviet Union, also referred to as the USSR. First, some context. And that context necessarily has to come out of the history of communism as an idea that developed in the industrial era. So as we've seen, communism, in theory, grew out of the socialist movement of 19th century Europe. At that time, Europe was undergoing rapid industrialization and massive social change. During the Industrial Revolution, when people moved from relying only on manual labor to harnessing machine labor, socialists blamed capitalism for creating a new class of poor factory workers who labored under harsh conditions for wages. This widened the gap between rich and poor, and it created a whole host of social problems that we've studied in depth already. Enter Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Like other socialists, these two wanted to end capitalism and stop the exploitation of workers, which they saw as morally wrong. Most reformers at the time wanted more peaceful transitions to a more fair kind of world. Like socialists believed in the power of striking and government reforms, sometimes democratic, to create a more equal playing field for the workers and the bosses. But Marx and Engels believed that this was not adequate. Instead, they promoted a more violent vision of revolution and called their theory communism. In 1847, Marx and Engels joined a group of working class leaders in what was called the Communist League, and they were asked to write down their ideas for the League, and they did in a work that changed the world, the Communist Manifesto, in 1848. They believed that the history of the world was a history of struggles between people at the very top of the social hierarchy, people who own things, and the workers, people who put their sweat into creating value that ultimately they don't get to profit from. The proletariat, they called them, the working class. The idea here was that overthrowing the ruling class was the only way to create a more just sort of world. The thing is, there are two problems here. One, Marx and Engels advocated a temporary dictatorship to seize property from people at the top of the hierarchy and crush attempts to sabotage a new government. However, as we've seen in history, temporary dictatorships tend not to be very temporary. And there wasn't any real sort of a plan for what happened next. Marx and Engels also expected this working class proletarian revolution to start in a highly developed, highly industrialized Western country like France, Germany, Britain, or the United States. The reason being, industrialized states can create a lot more wealth than non-industrialized states can. And if you're going to create a state where people can equally share in the wealth, it helps to have a lot of it. Russia, at the time of the Russian Revolution, was very much not industrialized at all. It was still basically a feudal state, barely in the early stages of the transition to capitalism. The economy was very much based on farming, not industry. And the political system was still a monarchy headed by a czar, which is the Russian word for king. Right? So, problems already on the horizon. The plan to create a communist world with a dictatorship that in theory would go away isn't a great plan because dictators tend to want to keep their power. And two, Russia was not an ideal candidate for a communist revolution according to the theory that Marx and Engels laid out in the Communist Manifesto. Moreover, Russia was not the most stable of states to begin with, even before World War I. And because it was so far behind the curve of other European states in terms of modernizing, there had been hints of unrest for years before. In 1905, for example, Russia had just humiliatingly lost a war to Japan, and middle class and upper class Russians wanted Russia to adopt a more constitutional system of government like those in Western Europe. In January 1905, in St. Petersburg, the capital of Russia at the time, a large and peaceful group of workers and their families marched to the Winter Palace to give then Tsar Nicholas II a petition asking for reforms. And instead they were shot, thousands of them, in what is remembered as Bloody Sunday. As a result, there was radical uproar, strikes, insurgencies spread through the country, and they were all quashed. Although the czars did have to give some concessions, one of them including like basic early steps towards some representation for the people. But the king kept his power. Have a look at who was in charge of Russia during World War I. Here we have Tsar Nicholas II. He was about as silly as he looks in these pictures. He wasn't super bright. He was cousins with the leader of England and the leader of Germany at the time, and he was trying to rule a big, shaky country without really knowing a whole lot about how to do that well. There are also some interesting subplots here, including his heir to the throne had a condition called hemophilia, which means if you start bleeding, you basically keep bleeding. It's super dangerous. And his wife was convinced that this like crazy monk named Rasputin, who's pictured on the top right, could help, and he couldn't. And if that's at all interesting to you, I encourage you to look up how that story ends, because it's a weird subplot in history. But anyway, back to the main point. This is the guy who was, in charge of Russia during World War I. He was making decisions. He was the kind of guy who was convinced that he made good decisions, even though he kind of didn't. World War I was the catalyst for revolution in Russia. It was a disaster for both the Russian people and for the Tsar. Because Russia hadn't industrialized before going to this war, it had an incredibly difficult time arming, equipping, and supplying the 15 million soldiers it sent into combat. There are stories about soldiers who went hungry, who lacked shoes, who lacked weapons. There are even stories of soldiers marching off with broom handles painted black so that they'd look like guns, but they weren't actually. It was just, all in all, really, really bad. It was so bad that Russian casualties were greater than those sustained by any army in any previous war, ever. Not a record you want, for sure. Meanwhile, goods became scarce in the homeland. Prices of just about everything, like bread, skyrocketed, and by 1917, famine was threatening cities. Famine means starvation. So if you're in a city and you can't get food and you're worried about starving, that is the makings of a classic revolution. In World War I, almost an entire generation of young men was lost. The combat death toll for Russia alone was 1.7 million. A staggering number of Russian soldiers mobilized became casualties. And in addition to all of that, the war is costing Russia 22 billion. It was not a sustainable sort of situation. And yet, Russia was led by Tsar Nicholas II, who was absolutely sure that he could make decisions that could turn things around all the time. He didn't. And so after a series of military defeats in World War I that were pretty directly the Tsar's fault, combined with just the general question of why are we fighting this war anyway, combined with famine and widespread strikes in the cities, Russia was primed for revolution by 1917. And indeed, Russia had two. The first came in February 1917, when protesters, mostly women, took to the streets demanding food and an end to the war. The army that had been called in to put down this protest joined the protesters, and the Tsar, was then forced to abdicate, to abandon his throne. So he goes off to the countryside under guard. A few months later came a second revolution that transformed Russia into the Soviet Union, brought Lenin and his Bolshevik party into power, and ended with the Tsar dead, along with his whole family, which was, for Europe, just a shock. As we can see, as is often the case with revolutions, famine or threat of starvation tends to motivate people to take action pretty effectively. By 1918, you'll see that Russia was approaching food shortage all over the place and in famine conditions already. So let's look at revolution number one, the February Revolution, the first one. Mass protests in St. Petersburg demanding peace, liberty, and bread led to strikes. And the soldiers, who were in large part peasants, brought in to restore the peace, ended up joining the protesters. That's usually end game for any ruling regime, when the soldiers join the protesters. As a result, the Tsar surrendered and abdicated his throne, and a provisional government, so a temporary, in the meantime, government, was created, led by business leaders and local Soviets. But that provisional government made a gigantic mistake, and it chose to stay in the war. And here you see pictured Kerensky, the head of that provisional government, with soldiers in the spring of 1917, making that mistake. Let's continue to fight this losing war. In the meantime, enter Lenin. Vladimir Lenin was a revolutionary who had already gotten kicked out of Russia for this sort of thing before World War I started. Germany's plan was to send him back to St. Petersburg in secret, to start a revolution, to kind of kindle something to tip Russia over the edge so that Russia would drop out of the war, so that Germany would have an easier time fighting the West. It does this. So Lenin gets shipped back to Russia in April and begins gaining support for his Bolshevik party with slogans like peace, land, and bread, which for a war-weary, starving population is a pretty effective slogan. By October, he gets his chance, and we have the second, the more radical revolution in Russia. In the October Revolution, Lenin and the Bolsheviks staged a nearly bloodless coup d'etat, which means a sudden seizure of power. So they take over, they replace the provisional government, they establish the Soviet Union, which is the world's very first communist state, which again is a radical departure from anything that had happened before. So Europe does indeed kind of tremble with this state of affairs. Exits the war, and also shoots the Tsar and his whole family. There's a picture of the room on the bottom right of the slide. Well, let's pause here and take some preliminary notes. We're going to take notes in a couple parts of this lesson, but first let's just describe the basic set of events that occurred, because the Russian Revolution is complicated and we're going fast. So the Russian Revolution, a good description, it was a political, social, and economic revolution. So it changed the form of government, the form of economy, and the social hierarchy in Russia, led by Vladimir Lenin. And it definitively overthrew the Russian monarchy and replaced it with the world's first communist state, the Soviet Union, during World War I in the year 1917. It's worth noting that a problem here is that Russia had not yet industrialized, so this transition to communism is likely going to be very rough. There are many causes of the Russian Revolution, but the most immediate one was for sure Russia's increasingly unpopular and failing participation in World War I, which led to huge casualties, poverty, rising costs of food, and hunger. Lenin gained support by promising peace at all costs, which he delivered once he came to power, signing a separate treaty with Germany to pull out of the war, and by promising land and bread to the peasantry. In more detail, let's note the two revolutions that occurred in 1917 so that you can have kind of an order of events. In the first revolution in February, Lenin had nothing to do with this one. The Tsar abdicated and was replaced by a provisional government with power shared between business leaders and local Soviets. A Soviet, by the way, was the word for a local council of socialists that made decisions democratically. The way this shaked out was mass protests in St. Petersburg demanding peace, liberty, and bread, so an end to war, democratic rule, and better standards of living, and strikes, and soldiers who were brought in to restore peace joining the protesters amounted to revolutionary change. The Tsar surrendered. He gives up his throne. And the provisional government was created, but it makes a gigantic mistake almost immediately and decides to stay in the war. In the meantime, Lenin, a communist and a revolutionary, and the leader of the Bolshevik Party, got shipped back to Russia in April and began to gain support for his party with slogans like peace, land, and bread. To get from revolution number 1 to revolution number 2, we just need to look at this decision. The provisional government decided to remain in World War I, which gave Lenin and his Bolshevik Party a shot to seize power, which they do. And Russia, as a result, became the Soviet Union, the world's first communist state, and the Tsar and his family are shot. In this October Revolution, revolution number 2, the coup d'etat results in the seizure of power. As a result, Russia becomes the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is the world's first communist state, and Russia exits World War I. Of note, the Soviet Union is sometimes referred to as the USSR. Just know that they refer to the same place, which used to be called Russia. As a result, Lenin effectively does get the Soviet Union out of World War I, so he delivers on the peace promise. And then he nationalizes industry and begins to collectivize agriculture, which relates to the land and bread part of the promises that he made. And he creates the Red Army to defend the revolution. Now, this is important because clearly there were people in Russia who were not fans of this transition, and so civil war erupted almost immediately. But then also, other states in Europe and the United States were very interested in this revolution not succeeding. You can't just go around shooting members of the monarchy, thought, other monarchs in Europe. This is terrible. This cannot be allowed to stand. So they got involved and tried to stop the revolution, and perceiving themselves to be under attack, the revolution then became more extreme. Again, this is a very classic pattern in revolutions. Part of the results of that extremism, because of the Civil War and because of attempts by other states to put down the revolution, you get an increasingly authoritarian government in the new Soviet Union, and that's a trend that would continue to tragic end. So pause the slide here and then press play again so that we can keep going after you take notes. And this brings us to the second part of our story of the Russian Revolution and the consolidation of the Soviet Union. And that part involves Stalin, industrialization, and totalitarianism in the Soviet Union. We can start to think about this shift from Lenin to Stalin generally in terms of what it means to become communist in different times in this place that is now called the Soviet Union. When we say that Russia became the Soviet Union and the Soviet Union became communist, what exactly did that mean? It meant a couple of things, and this relates to a pretty big transition over the span of about a decade. So under Lenin, first, when the Soviet Union was established, it meant especially nationalizing industry, which meant major industries like land, mills, mines, factories, that sort of thing, were taken from their owners and put under state control. This was referred to at the time as war communism, and it went from 1918 to 1921, when World War I was over, but a civil war in Russia was still going, and involved redistributing all of these things, either putting them under state control or redistributing some land to peasants. This did not go well. It didn't solve any economic problems, and actually it created several. And so as a result, by 1921, Lenin instituted what was called the New Economic Policy, which attempted to kind of moderate the changes that he tried to put into place maybe too quickly. So it brought back some elements of capitalism to some sectors, like peasants were allowed to sell surplus grain for a profit, but they still had to pay a tax on what they produced. Some small factories were handed back to private ownership because, as it turns out, you can't give factories to people who don't know how to run them and expect them to still actually operate very well. Most important industries, however, were still controlled by the state. And as a result, the economy and production began to improve. Becoming communist also under Lenin definitely meant the formation of a Red Army, an armed force to defend the communist revolution. And that happened basically as a result of the Civil War. So these were like the early stages of Russia becoming communist, and then something happens. Lenin dies fast. The Russian Revolution was in 1917, and by 1924, Lenin is dead. This led to a power struggle, which is another fascinating little side story in history because the person who lost the power struggle ended up in Mexico City hanging out with Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo until he was killed. Anyway, his name was Trotsky. If you want to look that up, I suggest it. Great story. The story ends with Stalin, who's pictured on the bottom next to Lenin. He's a short, vicious, terrible man. He wins that power struggle and took power in the Soviet Union. As a result of Stalin's rise to power, everything became more extreme. What was already becoming an authoritarian government under Lenin became a totalitarian government under Stalin. And while Lenin had tried to kind of walk back the radical shift to communism that ended up causing mass hunger, Stalin kind of doubled down on it. He began collectivization of agriculture on a huge scale, which is the same thing as nationalization. It meant taking farmland for the purpose of the state to feed an increasingly industrializing nation. But like that transition caused widespread famine because it wasn't done efficiently, if it can be, I don't even know. So like lots of people die. He also instituted 5-year plans to industrialize Russia in record time. Like most other states took generations to transition from feudalism to capitalism and industrialization. And here Stalin is saying we're going to do it in 5 years, in a couple of 5-year plans. So like within a decade. The urgency for this step was real. Russia had not transitioned to industrialization before becoming communist, and as it turns out, it's a pretty important step. Also, Russia was surrounded by states that did not like, the Soviet Union was surrounded by states that did not like the fact that it existed as a communist state, so it felt under threat. And all of those other states were industrialized, so there was pressure to industrialize just for self-defense. To industrialization, Stalin announced, rightly, we are 50 or 100 years behind the advanced countries. We must make good this distance in 10 years. Either we do it or we shall be crushed. The Soviet Union would take drastic steps to promote rapid industrial growth and strengthen national defense in what was known as the 5-year plans. And the thing about it is that they worked. The economy grew 400%. Unemployment dropped to 0. And within a generation, the USSR transformed from a feudal peasant country to a state capable of competing with the United States in the space race. It also saved the USSR from being completely overrun by Nazi Germany. And at the time, from the outside, this looked like an amazing success story. The capitalist world, after all, was in the Great Depression at the time. But this came at an enormous human cost that was largely hidden from the outside. Human costs included impossibly high quotas to increase the output of steel, coal, oil, and electricity. The government limiting production of consumer goods, which led to huge shortages of housing, food, clothing, and other necessities. And the government choosing the workers, assign them jobs, and determining their working hours, with workers needing police permission to move. In terms of agriculture, in 1928, the government seized over 25 million privately owned farms in the Soviet Union and created collective farms out of them, which were large government-owned farms that each had hundreds of workers producing food for the state. However, Stalin used terror and violence to force peasants to work on these collective farms, and between 5 and 10 million peasants were killed. Million. This kind of radical shift also involved a radical shift in form of government. The Soviet Union, in this transition, became totalitarian. That means that the state was in control not only of the economy, not only of the law, but also of people's private lives. Like, there were no individual rights in the Soviet Union because what mattered most was the ideological goal of transitioning into a communist state. So as a result, you get the secret police called the Cheka, you get secret labor camps called gulags that were just horrific. State control of the media, propaganda that was more like brainwashing than like anything that we see here. Literally rewriting history. So Stalin would, before Photoshop existed, he would put himself in pictures where he hadn't been and take people out as those people came to be perceived as political enemies and were eliminated. So like he would not just kill them, but literally erase them from history. It involved having informers and spies, and it was really oppressive. So this was one example of totalitarian government. It wasn't going to be the only one. The thing about this part of the transition is that the part of Russia's transition to the Soviet Union that was most visible from the outside wasn't this totalitarian, scary part. It was the economic success part, because the Soviet Union did industrialize super fast. And as a communist state, it was bordering on full employment during the exact years when the capitalist world went into economic depression. So, as a result, in the capitalist world, in other parts of the world who didn't see the scary repressive side of the story, communism looked like maybe a great alternative to capitalism. It was working when capitalism was failing. And as some people came more drawn to that ideology, you had a reactionary fear of communism growing too, that itself became increasingly extreme and fed into fascist politics. So looking a little bit more closely at this rapid industrialization under Stalin's 5-year plans, let's look at words from the man himself, Joseph Stalin, on industrializing the country in a speech from 1928. Stalin said, "The question of a fast rate of development of industry would not face us so acutely as it does now if we had such a highly developed industry and such a highly developed technology as Germany." In other words, the industrialization question wouldn't be as big of a deal if we were on par with Germany, but we're not. He continues, "The whole point is that we are behind Germany in this respect, and we are still far from having overtaken her technically and economically. The question of a fast rate of development of industry would not face us so acutely if we were not the only country, but one of the countries of the dictatorship of the proletariat. If there were a proletarian dictatorship not only in our country, but in other more advanced countries as well. Germany and France say." So in other words, industrializing fast wouldn't be so pressing if we weren't the only communist state in the entire world, but we are. He continues, "If that were the case, if there were other communist states, the capitalist encirclement of the Soviet Union could not be so serious a danger as it is now. But you know very well that it is not yet the case, and that we are still the only country of the proletarian dictatorship, and are surrounded by capitalist countries, many of which are far in advance of us technically and economically. So in other words, we're in danger. We're the only communist state in the entire world. We have no help, and all of our enemies are better than us, economically, technically. So in other words, we need to industrialize really fast." Which is, that was true. They were surrounded. But the way that this happened was horrific for a lot of people. And here I'm going to read from a book by Anne Applebaum called The Iron Curtain, fantastic historian on all things related to this. She writes, The new economic policy. So Lenin's idea to moderate communism by reintroducing bits of capitalism to increase productivity was abolished in 1928 and replaced by a 5-year plan and a new set of policies that eventually became known as Stalinism, a push for faster industrialization, forced collectivization, centralized planning, draconian restrictions on speech, literature, the media, and the arts, and the expansion of the Gulag, the system of mass forced labor camps. And here you see a map of where these forced labor camps were. They're everywhere in the Soviet Union. In Siberia, these were particularly rough because it is incredibly cold up in this region. On the other hand, the 5-year plans did work. Russia did industrialize, production did skyrocket, but at what cost? And this is kind of the theme for Stalin, a figure who towered over the 20th century, even though he was shorter than my mother, who is like 5'4". Stalin was for sure an extremist. He believed that individual lives didn't matter if they were in the way of his ideological goals. And so a person's life can be expended if it stands in the way of what he saw as progress. He didn't respect human rights, clearly then. He instituted the Cheka, which was political police that spied on people in their homes. Like, it wasn't even a question of free speech in public. If you said something that went against the regime in private, you could be hauled off to one of those labor camps and never heard from again. Also, interestingly, it involved Stalin to different degrees just deciding that he could dictate reality. So changing reality and history to suit his current political needs. And one great example of this is what he did to official photographs, as different people in those photographs came to be seen by him as enemies. They would just vanish, as you can see in this series, where like eventually over the years, Stalin appears alone. And this little guy too, who just gets completely erased from history and from the official photograph that he'd been in before. This is a hallmark trait of totalitarian government. As the expert on totalitarianism, Hannah Arendt notes, the ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or the dedicated communist, but people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction, true and false, no longer exists. In other words, totalitarian leaders get very good at blurring the line between true and false and getting their followers to do the same, so that at the end of the day, what's true isn't so relevant as what is politically convenient for them. This is one of those things that can be really dangerous because societies can get very used to living this way. And it's one of the reasons why sticking up for the truth, even in little matters that might not seem super important, like dumb conspiracy theories about the earth being flat, actually really does matter. Because once you abandon your ability to distinguish truth from falsehood, or once you decide that you don't care about that distinction, really bad people can exploit it to really horrific ends. Here we can see, for example, Lenin speaking to Red Army troops during the Civil War part of the story. And right next to Lenin, right here, there's a guy named Trotsky. He was the man who lost the power struggle with Stalin to take over. And in later versions of this photograph, he is erased from the photograph. It's like he was never there. And he was killed in Mexico City. Totalitarianism refers to a form of government that takes total control over every aspect of public and private life. It goes against all of the democratic values that we know about freedom and human dignity and the worth of individual people and individual rights. To realize this vision, Stalin transformed the USSR into a totalitarian state. Totalitarian states share several characteristics. Notably, they're run by dictatorships with absolute authority over the country, and often those dictatorships are led by a dynamic leader with a utopian goal, so like a vision for the nation of perfect equality in this case, although that goal is different depending on the ideologies. They involve having state control over all sectors of society, meaning business, family life, labor, youth groups, housing, religion, education, the arts, etc., 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 and state control over the individual, demanding absolute obedience and denying them any basic liberties. Totalitarian states used organized violence to crush opposition. They involve state control of the economy, here in terms of the 5-year plans and collective farming to industrialize. But as we'll see on the right-wing fascist totalitarian states, they also involve taking centralized control of the economy to promote different ends. They involve police terror, here meaning the Great Purge, whereby Stalin's political opponents vanished to the gulags. Religious persecution, propaganda to mold people's minds, and education being controlled by the government to promote ideologically suitable subjects. Art was used at great lengths to mobilize workers and to mobilize the people in service of the ideological goal, in this case of communism. Education was centrally monitored, so the government controlled all aspects of education, what was taught, how it was taught. They learned the virtues of communism, the evils of capitalism, and they learned history as Stalin wanted it to be told, not as it was. And control methods increasingly involved police terror, meaning monitoring telephone lines, reading people's mail, planting spies, arresting millions of supposed traitors. The Great Purge, which eliminated anyone who threatened Stalin's power. Estimates range from 8 to 13 million people victims of this purge. And censorship. As a result, the government controlled all media, newspapers, movies, books, etc. Propaganda was a big part of this because totalitarian leaders on both the right and the left used propaganda not so much to convince people, but kind of more in the line of indoctrinating or brainwashing them. Most states use propaganda. You will see it everywhere. You will see it in democracies, but the way it works in totalitarian regimes is way more heavy-handed. And of course, doctoring photos. To rewrite history as he saw fit was a hallmark of Stalinist rule. Like we noted before, when Stalin was consolidating power and implementing his 5-year plans, the United States and the rest of the Western world was going through the Great Depression, which is exactly what it sounded like. During the Great Depression, capitalist countries, they seemed completely unable to meet the needs of their people. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union had industrialized. It was being productive. Unemployment wasn't a problem in the Soviet Union, or so it seemed from the outside. And so communism came to be seen as an increasingly viable, maybe even a preferable system to a lot of people in the Western world. And that caused a lot of instability because it caused a big reaction from the right wing, from fascist ideologies that came to gather a lot of support for equally horrific political regimes just by being anti-communist. So now that we've looked at the transition to what becoming communist meant under these two incredibly important, incredibly influential dictators, Lenin and Stalin, please pause here and take notes.